let's start with reflecting on what the challenge is. Kwa nini tuko na watu wachache? Do we have an idea what people are going through? Henry, do you have an idea what challenges people are facing?
Some people don't have access to internet in the areas they're specifically in right now.
How are they coping in this semester now?
Some they wait for others to attend and give them a heads up.
How? I've never seen you people discussing class material on the platform. You heads up mnawapatianga aje?
Kwa group ya class. Kwa WhatsApp.
But we have a WhatsApp group, and I don't see that those discussions going on there.
Inbox. Some inbox. And
people are learning by rumors, eh? That's not a very good thing to do.
True.
How can you learn by rumors now? What did he say? What did he say? What did you hear? Oh my. Okay. But luckily the recordings are on the platform. What I just sort if they want. Has the student leadership tried to negotiate data? Henry, do you know anything about that? Who is our class leader here? Who is the SSW class leader?
Hello?
Yes.
I'm the class rep for SSW 200.
Yes, Mumina. Have you worked with the student leadership to negotiate data? Because as Henry has just indicated, one of the reasons we are always under 10, I think the largest class we ever had was 14, is that people are having internet challenges. Is the student leadership trying to negotiate data?
I'm not in touch with the student leaders as much.
You know you are our link to COEA, so you need to be in touch with the dean of students, you need to be in touch with the academic whatever, student leader.
I'm in touch with the student leader for FAST, the chairperson, but I'm actually in a group chat, but they don't actually talk about data and how to connect every student.
But you know that you are the human rights person here, rights-based approach.
Okay, I will call.
Mumina, slowly, access to education. One of the limitations of access now is internet and data. So if it is the case that we have students who are not able to access, it might be good that the student leadership across universities begin discussing this and figure out how to engage the internet service providers and government to subsidize data for learning for university students. As you're already aware, primary schools and high schools have been pushed to January. There is a possibility that they will not push universities, but you guys are expected to survive better online than the primary and secondary school fellows.
I speak on behalf of my classmates. For us, we're only 6, we are very few. And as far as I know, most of us are able to attend the classes.
You are very few, so you don't care about the majority.
No,
and you're a social worker.
I care. I'm in touch with other students and they tell me they've been attending class, so I've not heard of any challenges so far.
So Mumina,
it's only other lecturers that are not sending in work in the portal or teaching us.
Mumina.
Yes?
I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm not blaming you. I'm just activating you to think in rights-based terms. Otherwise, these subjects unasoma zitakuwa zinakufa bure if they are not applicable. what we are dealing with now is
Mm-hmm.
the question of access to education. True or false?
True.
Yes. Yes, Mumina and her 6 colleagues are fully comfortable because they can access. But you are aware that you have a bulk of other students who might not have access. And because we are in a situation where we should be problem solvers, you need to be thinking about how to activate other students to think seriously about what can be done to improve access for our, maybe the other social work students are not as lucky as those 6 who are in this course, So
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to make is that it is necessary that students of human rights look at human rights issues around them. And at this point of time, access to education is a real issue that is being inhibited by the question of data and internet access. So there should be a creative way in which student leaders at this point in time should be reflecting on it. And it starts by a simple challenge from Momina to other student leaders, challenging them to think about it and reach out to the dean of students, figure out what can be done. Okay?
Okay.
All right, ma'am. These things we learn are not just supposed to be left on in the books. Now, Tasha keeps dropping in and out. So let's get started. We were supposed to start at 9, but I think it's okay, we can start now. Today, we are going to reflect on human rights mechanisms. Sorry, you keep dropping in and out. Pole sana. I hope that we won't lose you.
Okay.
We are doing international human rights mechanisms. Remember when we are beginning the class, we said that for someone to adopt a human rights-based approach to social work, human rights-based approach to development, you ought to know the rights, you ought to know their sources, you ought to know the actors, and you ought to know the mechanisms, and finally the conflict of rights. Okay, so we are at the level of the international human rights mechanism. Before we move into those mechanisms, I need to first hear from you if you have any questions from what we've learned before. If any of you is here and they've been part of the previous classes and there are questions you'd like to respond to, let's deal with them in the next 5 minutes before I move into the international human rights mechanisms. By this point in time, you ought to know your right in terms of what is the right to education, normative criterion thereat. You ought to know the sources, which international instruments or regional instruments or domestic instruments, and what are the actors in terms of the state as established by duty bearers and rights holders. Do we have any preliminary questions? All your microphones can be switched on if you want, and tell me what is going on. Any questions from the previous learning? I know some of you have been able to go to the slums already. Others have not yet, but that's okay. Do you have any questions now? Sasa mmeninyamazia aje? Or you want to type in the chat room? Could make use of the chat room if you want, a few minutes. Catherine, you have something to say?
No.
You have no question?
No.
Catherine, which right are you handling?
Health.
You're handling health. So what are the sources of the right to health? Catherine? You went mute on me. Sasa. It's interesting. Learning. Caroline, you want to say something? Andrew. Yes. You'd like to share? Before we start the human rights mechanisms, are we good with our knowledge of rights? Are we good with our knowledge of the sources? Are we good with our knowledge of the actors? Mumina?
Yes.
Are we good?
Yes.
Which right are you handling, Mumina?
Food.
What are the sources of the right to food? Where do you look?
In my paper that I wrote. Hello?
I'm listening.
I looked at treaties that advocated for the right of food.
Just mention the 3 for me.
Give me a minute.
Oh yes, Mumina. My friends, I would like you to become micro experts in your right. There should be that quick conventional covenant you can mention relating to your right. Okay? That quick ingredient of the normative criterion of your right. There should be those things that are on your fingertips about your right. Okay? So that you don't need to first open some text or whatever to tell me. Yes, Mumina, you found something? Okay. Saru, you want to share?
I'm typing something on the chat room.
You're in the chat room.
Yes.
Okay.
There's the UDHR.
Yes. In full, some people don't know what UDHR is.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes, so you've opened the text now. Okay.
I can explain now that I know.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
It's a Declaration of Human Rights. It's something that is global and universal. It's a document, actually.
Which articles tackles food in the UDHR?
There's the International Convention of Rights relating to the right of food.
Hold on. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Which article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about?
Article 25.
Article 25, okay. Which other instruments did you find?
The African Charter of Human Rights.
We started with the international ones before we go to the African Charter. African Charter on Human and People's Rights is regional. Get me an international instrument, Mumina.
I could say the United Nations Child Rights.
Is the convention on?
Food as a right for children.
Which convention are you talking about? Remember last week I took you through the International Human Rights Covenants. I showed you where to find them. There are 9 core international human rights instruments at this point in time. So when I ask you to tell me which convention you're citing, I would be expecting you, for example, to talk about that convention on the rights of children. What is its name in full?
I mostly talked about the regional instruments. The international instruments emphasized on Article 25.
Article 25 is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But did you visit any other international conventions and covenants?
There's the United Nations Economic and Social Council.
No, I'm asking for a covenant or a convention, not a council. Allow me to harass you in this way so that others can know what it is I'm looking for. So yes, we are dealing with a convention or covenant. Can you name one that touches on your right to food?
Pass.
Don't pass now. You are getting scared for nothing.
Okay, please repeat the question.
Did you find the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights?
Yes.
Okay, it is called what?
I just saw, how is it called?
Mumina, just restate what
Yes.
I've said. I've called it the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Yes.
Just restate it, Mumina.
God,
Mumina,
yes.
the international instrument that deals with economic, social, and cultural rights is called what in full?
The OHCR.
No.
Okay, I'm really sorry.
Mumina, relax, relax. It is called the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Could you please restate that?
The Covenant of Economic and Social Cultural Rights.
The Covenant on
Covenant.
Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Yes. Now, you also mentioned something on children. What did you find? Which instrument did you find that deals with children?
I mostly found regional instruments in Africa.
You didn't find an international document on children?
Okay, I found one, but just generalized. So I dug deeper and looked at Africa specifically and Yemen.
Yeah. I'm trying to invite you people to do your research using the method I suggested. It will systematize your knowledge, okay? You need to make use of that website, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, access the international instruments, then you can move to the regional instruments. If you want to do your assignments by just getting into Google and typing a search term, all sorts of websites will come out and all sorts of commentaries will come out, but you will have missed out on the systematic of how you should know what you should know. I'm hoping that you guys should end up working with UNDP, working with UNICEF or UNESCO or various county entities. My hope is that if you know how to navigate the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, it would make your job easy in knowing how to find what to find if you are to think through the internationally agreed processes of thinking about these rights. Okay, so.
Wait, in the economic, social, and cultural rights,
Yes.
There's a document in part D. It talks about right to food.
No, I was hoping.
I think it's number 64.
I was hoping that you go to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights itself.
It's in here. Okay, let me type it in.
And that covenant, you would find an article, a specific article that makes reference to food as a right. Okay?
Okay.
For the record, I have put most of these covenants on the platform, actually. I downloaded them for you from the OHCR and uploaded them on the platform. So I would be expecting someone to name a specific article of the covenant, whether it is the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, Convention on the Rights of the Child, Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families. You name the specific article in each of these conventions that is applicable to your right, whether it is food, education, or housing. Okay. That's why I need you to keep asking me questions on the WhatsApp group so that we are able to move on the same track. Okay. So now let's proceed with our class for today. Today we are reflecting on the international human rights mechanisms. Okay. The UN human rights mechanisms, for us to understand them, we need to first and foremost be familiar with the basic structure of the United Nations. For sure, in 1945, when the United Nations was founded, it was founded on 3 pillars: peace and security, development, and human rights. So the principal organs of the United Nations are the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, and the Trusteeship Council. At the bottom, I'm listing the treaty bodies. We will be talking about them subsequently. Now, is there anything that you don't understand in these organs? Is there an organ you're seeing for the first time? Is there an organ of the UN you've not heard about? Is there an organ of the UN you would like elaborated on?
Sir, the Trusteeship Council.
You've not heard of the Trusteeship Council?
I never heard of it.
Trusteeship Council, by the way, all these 6 organs appear in they all appear in the UN Charter. The UN Charter is the Katiba, is the constitution of the UN. Okay, and these organs were created all in 1945. The Trusteeship Council was charged with overseeing the progressive independence of many of the states at that time that were not yet independent. Remember, 1945, very few African countries, most probably only 2 were independent at that time. So since then, we have the Trusteeship Council that was in charge of overseeing the progressive independence of these countries and having them become member states of the United Nations. Okay, as you know, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, we all became independent in the 60s. Okay, so that whole process was overseen by the Trusteeship Council. But since many states have already become independent, that's where you have the point of Trusteeship Council suspended. It doesn't seem to have a lot of work at this point in time. Andrew, is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other? Anyone would like to raise an issue with any of the other organs? I would presume that the silence means we are good with all of them. Are we good? Make use of the chat room if you are good with what we have. Andrew, you want to say something?
Yeah, we are good. We are good.
No, you are good. The others might be just quiet. The silence here is deafening. Okay. So now, what is the difference between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court? You see, there is an organ here, number 3, the International Court of Justice. I think I need to start giving out free marks. Okay, someone get into the chat room and tell me what the distinction is. The first 3 accurate responses get marks in their Moodle platform. Henry?
The International Court of Justice deals with countries, and the ICC specifically deals with individuals.
Okay, what does it deal with in countries? That's accurate, yes?
The disputes.
What are the common disputes between countries?
Crimes against humanity and maybe war and political clashes.
Tasha, crimes against
Humanity.
are dealt with by which court?
The ICC.
Okay, and what does the ICJ deal with?
The ICJ just it deals with it deals with settling arguments between countries.
Okay. So yes, that's quite accurate. The distinction between these two courts is threefold. One is younger than the other. The ICJ was founded in 1945 by the UN Charter. The ICC was founded in 1986 by the Rome Statute, but it became operational in 2001. The ICJ deals with the disputes amongst states, territorial disputes. You're lucky you have lived in a time when Kenya is struggling with Somalia. That matter was to be addressed by the ICJ. If the Mijingo issue was not dealt with on Lake Victoria, it would have ended up with the ICJ, okay, disputes amongst states. In our neighborhood, we've had decisions made against Uganda for its transgressions in the Congo. Several billions have to be paid because of that. So the ICJ award is connected to that dispute between states, territorial issues, military aggression, or, things like that. And then the ICC, for sure, as Henry pointed out, deals with persons most liable or most culpable for committing crimes against humanity, war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's the distinction for sure on that. Now, someone is writing on our slides. I don't know who it is. Did I give someone administrative rights? I don't know who it is. Okay. So let's proceed now. We have a rough idea of what. Now, you've heard about the Security Council. Yes, let's talk about the Security Council. I'm told Kenya has just won a seat on the Security Council. Is that the case? When is Kenya's term at the Security Council starting? Many of you here are Kenyan. Others, we have the privilege of being students in Kenya. So we must know what is going on. When is Kenya's term at the Security Council starting? Any guess?
Yeah, true.
Andrew?
I think it's from next year.
Next year, yes, 2021. For how long?
It's not permanent. It's for, I think, 2 years or 1 year.
2 years, good. Okay, how many permanent members of the Security Council do we have?
Around 5.
They're not around 5, they are 5. Can we name them? The 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
France.
Russia, China, Zaitwa has posted.
The United Kingdom and the United States.
United Kingdom and the United States. By their permanence, we mean they are always present and they have the veto power at the Security Council. How big is the Security Council? How many member states are on the Security Council at any given time? Permanent? How many are not permanent?
There are 15, 5 are permanent, 10 are non-permanent.
Good. So the knowledge in our classroom is good with the organs. Yes, Security Council is 15 membership, 5 permanent, and 10 are revolving. Okay, fair enough. So we then proceed. The Secretariat is the common one because we have the Secretary Generals as the face of the UN. So many people, when you talk of UN, they think of Ban Ki-moon, they think of Antonio Guterres, they think of Kofi Annan, because those people have been the faces of the UN at any given time. We now need to proceed to the next. Now, the first mechanism, there are 3 mechanisms of human rights mechanisms of the United Nations. One is the special procedures, the second is the treaty bodies mechanism, and the third is the universal periodic review. We are going to try and cover those 3 today. Now, the special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council are independent human rights experts with mandates to report and advise on the human rights from a thematic or country-specific perspective. Now, the system of special procedures is a central element of the UN human rights machinery, and it covers all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social. Now, we need to update this. At March 27, 2015, we had 41, but I think we now have 42 thematic and 14 country mandates. Okay. The special procedures undertake to do country visits. They act on individual cases. They conduct thematic studies. They engage in advocacy. They raise public awareness, provide advice on technical cooperation. They report annually to the Human Rights Council, and the majority of the mandates also report to the General Assembly. When we say thematic mandates, we mean themes. So you would have a special rapporteur on the right to food, you would have a special rapporteur on extreme poverty, you would have a special rapporteur on housing, you would have a special rapporteur on internally displaced persons. Those are themes. But you would also have a special rapporteur on the situation in South Sudan. You would have a special rapporteur on the situation in Burundi. You would have a special rapporteur on the situation in Somalia or Colombia. So that's what we mean by country mandates. Okay, these special procedures are individuals, as you've said, or groups of experts who have been identified for their expertise in human rights or in various sections of human rights to be able to advise the United Nations on these themes or country mandates. They are not employees of the United Nations. They are independent contractors. But for sure, yes, they have to ride on UN logistics for them to do their job. They are not employees of the United Nations, they are independent experts. So yes, thematic reports to the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly annually. Mandate number 2, they do country visits, and they also do individual communications and urgent actions. When a country in which you are is incapable of dealing with human rights abuses directly, or there's a threat of reprisals, if you raise an issue in country, it then is possible for you to directly communicate to a special rapporteur under this mechanism of special procedures, and that's what we mean by individual communications and urgent actions. Okay, there are some former and present special rapporteurs that have impacted on human rights that I've had the opportunity to engage with that I would like to point out now. Okay, one is the special rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation, Catalina Alba. She is the former special rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation. I think she now runs a huge NGO called Sanitation, Water and Sanitation for All.org. I think I saw the website. But in her tenure, she contributed to redefining and guiding the United Nations into defining water and sanitation as a standalone right. Those of you dealing with water and sanitation, you would realize that in your attempt to trace that right, you would find it not expressly listed in the UDHR, not expressly listed in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and several other international covenants. It has always been, meaning water, has always been part of the right to adequate standard of living or the right to housing. They would plug it in there. But due to the work of Catalina Alba and her work as the Special Rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation, the UN in 2010 substantively defined the right to water and sanitation as a standalone right with its substantive normative criterion. Okay, when we were talking about water last time, you know, we did the normative criterion on the right to water and the normative criterion on sanitation. The normative criterion on sanitation was developed by the help and guidance of Catalina Alba. Okay, so we have a substantive right to water and sanitation based on the expert work and guidance of this Special Rapporteur, Catalina de Alba. Okay, the second I would talk about is the Special Rapporteur on the rights of internally displaced persons. He was the former Special Rapporteur. I think he was Malawian. I forget the name, something like Cheyana Boyani or something like that. This gentleman has been to Kenya twice. By the way, Catalina was in Kenya in 2014, but the Special Rapporteur on internally displaced persons was in Kenya twice. First in 2008 after we had slaughtered ourselves, and later in 2011. And he came to assess the situation of persons that are internally displaced, to establish whether the guidelines on international displacement, the international guidelines on internal displacements were being followed. I think they had been developed by someone called Deng earlier. So he comes around, and how do I get involved is that we have our partners in Geneva who had advised that, you know, the Special Rapporteur would be coming out, and our partners in Geneva knew that we were doing some advocacy work for internally displaced persons in an area north of Nakuru in Lower Subukia. So the itinerary that had been provided for the Special Rapporteur by the United Nations Human Rights Commission for Refugees, United Nations, UNCHR, United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, was done managing his logistics, and the itinerary he had been given was Nairobi, Nakuru, Eldoret. You see those highway refugee camps, and yet there were some internally displaced persons camps. And there was one camp up in 50 kilometers north of Nakuru that would have missed out on interacting with this Special Rapporteur. I think we had close to 2,500 families up there. So anyway, we reached out to the camp leaders on the ground, and it was short notice, so they couldn't come. So we interviewed them, documented their issues, and organized a meeting to see if we could present their concerns to the Special Rapporteur in Serena. And so we did, and we interacted with him, and it became clear that he had come as a way of a follow-up on what the situation was since he had left in 2008. The situation of IDPs has subsided in this country, but the IDPs, yes, Chaloka Beyani, thank you, Tasha. So the situation of IDPs has subsided now, but the implementation of the law relating to IDPs is yet to be fully realized. So if in your ministry as a social worker or development worker, you find that you have been placed in a context where you have to work with internally displaced persons, please, you need to go quickly and search on the international guidelines on internal displacement, and then find out the various country visits that these special procedures on the right to special rapporteurs on the rights of internally displaced persons have taken place, so that you may be able to authoritatively inform your programming in that area. Sometimes you are involved in some CBO. It does not do mainstream internal displacement work, but by the fact of where it is located and where your ministry is, you might get in touch with internally displaced persons. And displacement happens on any ground. It could be climatic disasters or environmental disasters, just like the water issues we had down in Kisumu, or it could be due to war or civil disturbance. Anything can cause displacement. But we have international guidelines on internal displacement. This is different from refugees, okay? Refugees cross international borders. Displacement is deemed to happen internally within the country. We then move to another special rapporteur. Again, he's a former special rapporteur because I interacted with these fellows in the 2000s, between 2009 and 2016. Is the former special rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter. Okay, I don't know if maybe he's now in charge of extreme poverty or I don't know what. But yes, Olivier made some major contribution to the right to food. The existing normative criterion on the right to food largely was insisting on quantitative increase in the amount of food available. So they were emphasizing food security. So you've grown enough food, you have enough in your reserve, so your food secure. What Olivier introduced in the discourse was food sovereignty. Why? The pursuit of food security had occasioned a situation where the big players in agribusiness, Syngenta, Monsanto, Cargill, Bayer, and all these big agribusiness companies had overrun smallholder farmers and replacing their seed, replacing fertilizer, replacing herbicides, and replacing pesticides. And the argument was, we are increasing food production and we are making people food secure. But with regard to the expert information that Olivier de Schutter had come across, there were countries, Bolivia, there were countries like Colombia, there are countries like Chile, where agroecology was discovered as a more sustainable way to grow food and feed the human population, and that agroecology would protect smallholder farmers who have always and continue feeding the world. It came to realization that most of the mass production of food had in the past been actually not feeding people, but it ends up feeding animals so that animals might be fed to human beings. So then Olivier develops this idea of inserting sustainable growth of food into the whole thinking in the right to food, that you cannot only pursue food security, you must also pursue food sovereignty. Farmers need to have control over their seed. Farmers need to be able to exchange seed. Indigenous crops will be protected. They're usually more resilient. The soils will be protected when we adopt agroecological practices and organic practices, and we will be able to give people wholesome food. Food grown organically is healthier than food grown conventionally. So that's the case that Olivier de Schutter was able to make, and is a case that most serious advocates for food would be able to pursue. Now, I know recently you've seen an advert going around on social media platforms calling for Kenyans to sign a petition against toxic chemicals that are being sprayed on our food. But toxic chemicals are just one thing. The toxic fertilizer exists. The chemicals are sprayed by way of herbicides, but they could also be sprayed by way of pesticides. And there's more toxicity that is also will be verified in the near future relating to how food has been engineered. Tasha is asking, is it possible that the agribusiness organizations such as Monsanto were called out for production of biochemicals, that were called out for rendering land infertile over time? Time is coming when they will be taken on. Monsanto has lost a few cases based on their product of Roundup. What I know that when people get more organized, they will be challenged on the fertilizer that they are promoting and the seeds that they have contaminated and the biodiversity they've challenged. They still play a big role now because they have a financial muscle. Some of these companies can fund entire economies. Their budgets could be tripling or doubling our national economy. So they're really powerful machines. But yes, there will come a time when they will be taken on and challenged for the damage they have done. But there's no challenge that is more serious than individuals taking a conscious decision to be critical about what they consume. That when you go to the marketplace, are you sure how this tomato has been grown? And if you're not sure, can you have the courage not to buy because you're not sure? And then can you organize a mechanism of consuming from farms you are sure about, that this farmer is growing the food and seed that is not genetically engineered, that this farmer is not using conventional fertilizer, is using organic fertilizer, that this farmer is not using dangerous herbicides. When we start promoting the business of these kind of farmers, usually they're smallholder farmers, then you can guarantee yourself the consumption of healthy food, and in that way you promote farmers who are growing healthy food. And when you promote them, farmers will progressively leave conventional farming and go to organic farming. So the consumer is the key player here. I had the opportunity to link with some young Franciscans in the Bungoma area, and they used to ship for me arrowroot. They could ship for me some sweet potatoes, and for a long time I was having my Wimbi millet directly from a farm that I know down in Bungoma. But that's a practice that anyone who is serious about the right to food has to inculcate amongst our people. The consumers must take a conscious decision to support smallholder farmers who are doing agroecological farming. A farm that you can visit and you know the way this guy produces his food is acceptable to us. Okay, so yes, those are the three special rapporteurs I wanted to mention. Kenya has had a special rapporteur on freedom of assembly and association. I think that was Maina Kiai. I don't know if I think he left that term. I don't know which other assignment he's been given, but you know that Maina Kiai had served as director for the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the NGO. Then he moved to chair the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, which is the national human rights institution. And after his term there, he was then taken up as special rapporteur on the freedom of assembly and association. And it was his job at that time to make sure that what happened yesterday on Sabasaba is challenged or documented, at least if not challenged. And it was his job that things that were happening in Uganda, the walk to work, the challenging the Public Order Management Act in Uganda that was limiting the movement of people power activities and freedoms of assembly, what was happening in Tanzania at that time. So yes, usually the special rapporteurs have that kind of wide mandate. They may enter a country on invitation, if a country has an open invitation, or they may depend on information given to them by the civil society organizations that are working on those relevant rights. So I look forward to a situation where some of you in whichever entities you will be serving are able to actually interact directly with special rapporteurs on substantive matters. Their emails are all listed on the platform. When you go to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and you check the human rights bodies. You will see special procedures under that tab. Navigate it. Find out, you might even have a special rapporteur who you know personally or who comes from your country of origin by virtue of service. So we then move on to the next category of our learning, and here we have the treaty bodies. By treaty body, we mean that committee established by an international covenant to monitor the performance of state parties. So I will keep saying this, as I said earlier, you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the relevant treaty is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So when I ask what is the treaty body relevant to housing, immediately you would know by treaty body I'm asking for committee. When I ask what is the instrument relevant to housing, the international instrument, you would know that I'm talking about the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is backed by the Human Rights Committee, but these days it is called the Committee on Civil and Political Rights. The Human Rights Committee is an older committee to many of the committees because it has been around longer than the others, because these civil and political rights are many a time considered first generation rights. Then we have the international, so we see we have two covenants, okay? The Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We now also have the other 7 conventions. So the International Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has a treaty body called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So where you have convention in the initial, you have committee, okay? The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, has the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. For example, someone could say, look here, Kenya was reviewed by, no, we can say Kenya ratified CEACR in 1972, and Kenya was reviewed by the CEACR 2 years ago. That statement means that in the first sense I was referring to the covenants. Kenya ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1972, but first filed its report 2 years ago, okay, to the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Right now, Kenya is under the process of review by the Committee on Civil and Political Rights. The list of issues were filed in March, and probably concluding observations from the committee will come out towards the end of this year. So you have CEDAW, which is the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is the treaty body in charge of monitoring performance of states relating to the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The Committee Against Torture, CAT, is the treaty body in charge of monitoring the performance of states with regard to the Convention Against Torture and all forms of inhuman and degrading treatment. The Committee on the Rights of the Child is the treaty body relevant to state parties that have ratified. Actually, there are many of them, up to 193 states have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Committee on Migrant Workers then deals with the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities would then monitor the performance of states with regard to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Committee on Enforced Disappearances would then deal with the Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. So when we say treaty bodies, we mean those committees of experts formed under these conventions. Usually part 4 of each of these conventions or covenants would establish a treaty body and how it would work. Now, when we went to the website of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, we showed you how you are able to access the websites of each of these treaty bodies to see what they do. So yes, a sort of a summary here, the treaty bodies, their roles are to monitor the enforcement of the treaties, are governments respecting, fulfilling, and protecting the rights in that covenant, interpretation of the treaties using the general comments. This is a familiar term now. When we say the right to health in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, what do we mean by the right to health? So you find a general comment in which the treaty body has explained the content of this specific right. When we talk about the right to water and sanitation, you would find a general comment on the right to water, and then you would also find from the special procedures an explanation of what the normative criterion on sanitation is, and then you're able to deal with that right specifically. By knowing your right, based on the general comments, you can claim substantive knowledge of what your right is. So we said know your rights. That's what we mean by knowing your right. You know which general comment has explained it and the normative criterion proposed by that general comment. But yes, treaty bodies also deal with individual complaints. Okay, the Convention Against Torture has been very useful in this area. People have been locked away. In Uganda, there is a practice of safe houses, which are not actually safe houses, but they're illegal detention centers. I don't know if it is happening in other countries. Someone is kidnapped. They're not taken to a police cell. They're not taken to the usual imprisonment facilities or gazetted imprisonment facilities, but someone just goes missing and they are being held by security agents, but in ungazetted places. When you get to know something about that, the treaty body that would be relevant could be either the convention, the Committee Against Torture, or the Committee on Civil and Political Rights. So this is how the treaty bodies work. We would start off with consultation for a state report. For each of these treaties, states that have signed, states parties, commit to file reports to the relevant treaty body every so often. And each treaty body has its cycle. Some it is 3 years, others it is 4 years, others 5 years, you know. And each treaty body has its own reporting mechanism. But it would always start off with a consultation and state report. For example, if it is for review by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the starting point would be the various state departments touching on housing, touching on health, touching on food, touching on water and sanitation, touching on education, would have to pull their heads together and provide a sort of self-assessment on how they are meeting their obligations under this treaty, under this convention, or under this covenant. Then civil society organizations would be allowed to develop, civil society organizations would then be allowed to develop an alternative report. What does that mean? When the government claims that, look here, we are meeting our obligations under the right to education, and actually education is physically accessible, it would be at this point in time that Momina, Andrew, and Tasha would say, look here, physical infrastructure for internet is not accessible at this point in time where internet is part of the infrastructure necessary for education. That we are in a class of 50 students, but we have never had more than 20 students in class because Andrew says people have challenges with internet access. Okay, so that kind of information would come out in an alternative report to the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights with regard to the question of education. Fair enough? Now, when the two reports have been filed, there will be a session called the pre-session of the committee. And at this pre-session of the committee, a list of issues is developed based on the state report and the alternative report. A pre-session is held. Pre-session means before the main session, to develop a list of issues which government will be expected to respond to. Okay, so the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, this treaty body, will generate a list of issues based on the alternative report and the state report, asking government to clarify what it is it has done about certain aspects of the rights covered by the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This process happens for all other treaty bodies. It will happen in the Committee on the Rights of the Child. It will happen on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It will happen in the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Then after the list of issues is developed, states would develop a response. So just as a number of state departments were pulled together or contacted to provide the initial information, then when the list of issues is generated, the relevant government department, in this country it is the Department of Justice in the Attorney General's chambers, they will send a communication to the various state departments on whom the list of issues touches, asking for that information to be sent back to them so that they can provide a state response to the committee. Then a substantive review happens. So the members of the State Department for Justice would appear with the permanent delegate of Kenya in Geneva, and they appear before the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for a substantive review. Then we would have concluding observations. And after the review, the committee would then say, from what we've had, the dialogue between the state report, the alternative report, and the list of issues, and what the government has responded, we would conclude by giving the following recommendations to the state for the progressive realization of rights. So that's how the process goes. Of reviewing a government every so often. And then at the end of it, there is a follow-up on concluding observations. The organizations in this country that have benefited a lot or have been following up this matter are largely FIDA. Yes, I think FIDA has been on the processes for the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women for some time. They have filed a report, an alternative report at each review for Kenya under CEDAW, the Committee on Economic, on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. In the year 2009, I had an experience where we were preparing Franciscan women to be part of this process and to develop an alternative report. And at that time, we were talking about, I think it was maternal mortality, and the Franciscan women were arguing that, look here, women are dying as they go to hospitals, so we need to improve the roads. Women are dying because of, it was with regard to maternal health, they're dying because they're not receiving enough attention. We don't have enough obstetricians and gynecologists, or those who are there running private clinics, they're not serving us well in public hospitals, all these things. So anyway, so these Franciscan women, what they did, they said, okay, let's recommend that the government increases recruitment for the recruitment of obstetricians and gynecologists. Let's improve road infrastructure. Let's improve the maternity wings of all our hospitals, and sort of devolve or decentralize the maternity units, so that even at a level 4 hospital or a level 3 hospital, the maternity wings are really vibrant and well taken care of. Anyway, so when they went to develop at the pre-session committee, So we send these Franciscan women to go and deliver their report. And when the Franciscan lady was speaking, she was booed. I think we sent Sister Patricia and I think Jane Mudoga. Jane Mudoga is an advocate herself. And she's a married woman. She has her own children and whatever. So these people get booed at the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women as they deliver their report. And when we check out who was booing them, it was FIDA booing them. And we say, why would FIDA boo these women? And then it turned out that actually FIDA had for a long time been filing reports to CEDAW, but its approach to protecting women from maternal problems was that if women are dying due to maternal problems, it is better women never became pregnant in the first place. So they were promoting increased use of contraception, let government subsidize contraception, let government make abortion available, because in their estimation, that is the best way to stop women from dying in maternal and childbearing. So this proposal by other women, because since then, no other groups of women had been engaging on this matter except FIDA. So these women who are coming from the grassroots and delivering an alternative to solving the maternal health problem were sounding weird or strange, probably undermining the narrative that FIDA had been constructing for some time. So that explained why they were being booed. But for the record, the proposals we made came to pass because actually government listened at that point in time. It was 2009. The Kibaki government made steps towards improving maternal health. We also know that subsequently, the regime of Uhuru Kenyatta, I think, did these free maternal delivery services and all those kind of things. So yes, this is a process worth engaging in if you want to improve the human rights situation of the people you are serving. I'm willing to take some questions on treaty bodies and special procedures before we proceed to the Universal Periodic Review. Do we have any questions? Any questions? Why? You guys, you love people who talk like radios, eh? Nasikiliza tu. Yes. Andrew, hakuna swali? Gift, do you have a question? Okay, Henry. Tasha, do you have a question?
Nope.
Does that mean everything is clear or something is, nothing is clear?
It's digesting.
The hardware is processing.
Yes.
Okay. So shall we move on? No, someone has said something in the chat room. Let's see what we have. Okay, it's clear from Henry. Okay.
During this time, which is a very hard time for them, not in school, they've been suffering emotionally.
Okay.
So issues where they have to stay alive indoors. And this is a group of child depending on how much they're even interacting with the other. Right. How much they can compete, all that is demanding from them. And
okay.
Within the family.
So now let's proceed. No.
The question
No,
from
Hilary has a question on food. Eh? I was
Yes.
thinking about how food has become a problem since people want to make easy money. Yes, and after thinking, you've made a statement, Hilary, you've not asked a question. Or would you like a reaction from others?
if you have anything that you'd like to engage on,
Okay.
Joyce, working on the same, especially.
Yeah, easy money, easy money. The consumers can still determine
Why don't you start sending them in? Would be happy
what
to grow
the farmers will grow. They can still determine how the food gets to their table. You just have to be critical consumers. And as a social worker, as a development worker, you can just build capacity in the communities you're going to be serving. Make sure you're building common consumer groups, consumer cooperatives, that in this estate we know the what we eat comes from here, the guashia we eat comes from here, the maize flour we eat comes from here. It is possible. But that's the work of you development workers and social workers as you head out into the world. After graduating or even right now, you can already start thinking along those lines. Okay, so let's proceed now to the next human rights mechanism. And this one is the universal periodic review mechanism. As we said, these are mechanisms for monitoring the performance of states in respecting, protecting, and fulfilling rights. They are mechanisms that allow for the participation of everyone across the globe. So a social worker and a development worker out there has capacity to engage with these mechanisms on behalf of his people. He has capacity, or she has capacity to make the people they serve participate in these international processes. But you will not be able to do that unless you are able to document the rights. That's why I kept sending you to the informal settlements for that purpose. You learn how to describe the human rights situation in your area. Okay. So, the universal periodic review. What makes it universal? It is universal because all states are reviewed. It is universal because all states review, and it is universal because all human rights are reviewed. Okay, now remember that special procedures would only require a state invitation. You also know that the treaty body mechanism only applies to states that have ratified the treaty. Again, you know that the treaty body mechanisms, various reviews have taken place, but do you know that Kenya ratified the Convention on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights in 1972, but filed its first report in the 90s or later? Okay, so not all states are reviewed by the treaty body mechanism. Then all states review, okay, universality, all states review. So in the UPR, all states are reviewed. Yet in the special procedures and treaty bodies, not all states are reviewed. So we say the UPR is universal because all states are reviewed. We also say the UPR is universal because all states review, meaning that when Kenya is up for review, all the other states will be reviewing Kenya at that specific time. Okay, when Malawi is up for review, all other states will be reviewing Malawi at that specific time. When Tanzania is under review, all other states will be reviewing Tanzania at that time. That's what we mean by all states review. So Tanzania and its delegation sits at the front of the hall with the troika that has been selected, and then all the other permanent missions are in the plenary sending comments and review questions. Then we say that all rights, all human rights are reviewed in the UPR. Remember, special procedures are thematic or country. They deal with specific situations or specific themes. The special rapporteur on persons of on the rights of persons or on internally displaced persons deals with only that. The special rapporteur on housing, the special rapporteur on food, they deal with only that. Okay, the treaty bodies, as you can see, economic, social, and cultural rights, that is a cluster of rights. Discrimination against women, that's a cluster of rights. Rights of the child, that's a cluster of rights. Internally displaced persons, a cluster of rights. But when we get to the all human rights are reviewed in the UPR, the state party under review, will be examined on all rights, all covenants, all conventions during that period under review. Hope that's fair enough. What makes it periodic? It happens every 4.5 to 5 years for each country. So Kenya was first reviewed in May 2010. It was reviewed again in January 2015. And again, it has been reviewed in January 2020. 22nd January 2015 and 23rd January 2020. So Kenya has done 3 cycles of the universal periodic review. It is also periodic because it constitutes a midterm periodic review. Now, Kenya having been reviewed in January 2020, there will be a midterm review on how much it has done, what it has done between January and 2020, and most probably the beginning of 2022. Most probably there will be a midterm review around there. And then a follow-up of activities is sustained in the period under review. That's what makes it periodic. It is not an event, it happens all through in a cyclic manner. Okay, so yeah. And yes, so it's universal and it is periodic in character. It happens every 4.5 to 5 years for each country that is being reviewed. Each of you can check on the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. You can check the Universal Periodic Review section. You can search for your country, find out which documents have been filed in the previous cycles, and see what has been said about the right you are submitting about. So in summary, in image form, these are the stages or phases of the Universal Periodic Review. In the first phase of the Universal Periodic Review, we call it reporting phase, okay? And 3 reports will be prepared in this phase. The state report, the compilation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the report by the civil society, what we call the Stakeholder Reports. Okay, now by the reporting of the state, meaning that the State Department of Justice will call out Ministry of Health, will call out the State Department of Planning, will call out Gender, will call out all these various departments and ministries and ask them, tell us how you have performed with regard to human rights based on the recommendations that were made to us at the previous review. So each state department will have looked at already what recommendations were made in the previous review regarding the provision of services in its area. And it would then report to the Department of Justice in the Attorney General's chambers what has been done, so that the Department of Justice then processes a report that will be used by the state to report about itself to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in preparation for the following review. The second report, we are calling it the report on the UN bodies, but essentially it is a compilation of any human rights recommendations that have been made by 3 entities. 1, if there is any recommendation made by a special procedure to the country, to the state under review, during the period under review. Now, this is what I mean by state under review is the country that is going to be reviewed. Period under review is the first 5 years, the 4.5 or 5 years preceding the review. Now, when Kenya was being reviewed in January 23rd, the period under review was between January 22nd, 2015 and January 23rd, 2020. Okay, so the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in this second report would be looking out, have the special procedures made any recommendations to Kenya during that period? Have the treaty bodies made any recommendations to Kenya during that period under review? And finally, whether any UN agencies have made a human rights recommendation to Kenya during that period. Where I have put Kenya, you can put your country. You can put Malawi, you can put Uganda, you can put Tanzania, you can put Congo, whichever country you can place, okay? The same mechanism applies. And we are saying that the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights then compiles any human rights recommendations that have been made to the state under review in the period under review by special procedures, treaty bodies, and UN agencies. So it will be a summary report of sorts, usually not more than 10 pages. Then the third report is what we call the Stakeholder Report, or the report by civil society. Now, a number of civil society organizations all contribute. They contribute to this process of reviewing Kenya, okay? It is in these reports that you and I, who are serving in whichever part of the country, go ahead and prepare information relevant to the right you're concerned with. So when you are aware that you're working on the right to health, for example, and you know that government has claimed in its report that it has done probably increased hospitals, but it will not tell you that it has not recruited health workers. So you who is on the ground, who knows that people are going to hospitals and either not finding drugs or not finding health workers, it would then be your task to point that out in the stakeholder report that you will file for purposes of clarifying or affirming what government has said. So this civil society report, this stakeholder report, serves the purpose of affirming what government has said, critiquing constructively what government has said, or clarifying. Those of you in education, government has this tendency of saying we are pursuing a transition process. Everyone is transitioning. No one is staying in a class, perfect, and we have increased enrollment. That's how government will speak, that in the last time we were here, we only had 800,000 young people in primary school. We now have 1.5 million kids in primary school. So we have made progress in meeting our obligation to make universal primary education free and compulsory, okay? But you who is working with these people at the grassroots are aware that we have classrooms that are having one teacher teaching 200 kids. And you know that that affects the quality of the education. So you can then write in your report with specific researched information relating to the region you represent, indicating that government is doing a good job in enforcing universal primary education, but government should be encouraged to recruit more teachers so as to reduce the ratio. Or from what you know, there could be a shortage of scholastic materials. We have all these corruption issues that cause people to steal books and things like that. So it is in this civil society report that you are able to point out those things that are hindering the progressive realization of human rights. Okay? So that is the reporting phase. Government usually submits its first report 8 months to, then it can submit another report towards the end of the reporting phase. The civil society groups usually file their report 6 months, at least 6 months before the review, so that they get interacted with. Then there is the mainstream review. This happens in plenary, as in the UN Assembly Hall. Kenya would then be reviewed, or the state under review would be reviewed by other state parties. Now remember, you are a civil society entity, you are a CBO, you are an NGO, you are a community of people somewhere, you filed your stakeholder report through the processes. It is important that your recommendations in your report get to be made to the country under review. But because you are a civil society organization, because you are a CBO, you are a faith-based organization, you don't have access to the plenary of the UN. The UN is a member state entity. And because you don't have access to the plenary, how do you get your recommendations mentioned on the floor of the plenary? Hilary, Henry, how would you get your recommendations stated on the floor of the UN Assembly Hall? Aleta, you want to say something? Hilary, I don't know. Andrew, do you have an idea? Henry, do you have an idea? How would you get state parties to the UN to pronounce the recommendations? Okay. All right. Going. Anyway, so oh my. Okay, let's see the chat room here. Okay, Tasha says you would have to contact the special rapporteur. Mumina, you said you have a connection issue. Is it that you are not hearing me, or what's the issue? It's buffering. Is that the situation everyone is facing? Has it stabilized now? Yeah, I know, Andrew, you kept jumping out and returning. But my connection is okay on my end. Okay, stabilized. There's a possibility that whoever called my phone disrupted the, but I'm not using a hotspot. Okay. All right, so yes, now let me hear from you. Tasha says that one way of having your issue presented on the floor is by contacting a special procedure. But remember, we are in the UPR. Now, if you ask the special procedure to have an issue spoken on your behalf, the special procedure is not a member state, it's an independent expert. Okay, so someone tell me, how would you get your issues spoken on the floor of the House so that your recommendation gets heard by your state? Someone say something? If the UN Assembly, the Human Rights Council, is a gathering of UN member states, your organization is not a member state, but you filed a number of recommendations that must be addressed to the state during that session. How do you get that those recommendations pronounced to the state? Hillary, you're here. You worked on the right to housing. What recommendation would you like to give the government on housing, Hillary? 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 You're working on housing. What recommendation would you like to give government with regard to housing in Kenya? Momina, would you like to say something about health? What recommendation, from what you know, the basic information you have now about health, what recommendation would you like to give government so that we figure out how we could identify how to get it said on the floor? Momina?
For health, especially in Kenya,
Yes.
I'd recommend the government to provide better healthcare services, especially for pregnant women and young girls, especially when it comes to, you know what I mean by, like, with the rise of female teenage pregnancies on the rise. I'd like the government to put in place measures for mental health, especially for teenagers and children at that age, because it's a vulnerable age. So I'd recommend we have mental health facilities like counseling, psychiatry for women and children, especially during this time of Corona.
Okay, then the government will tell you that we have a mental health bill in the process. Have you had an opportunity to interact with the mental health bill?
I saw something on the news about depression on the rise and how the government is going to offer counseling services, something of the sort. But I don't think it's something that will go through, especially with the state of mental health practices and facilities in Kenya. Because they're highly privatized, and for you to even seek mental health, when you see the prices of counselors and psychotherapy, you just get discouraged. People end up resorting to drugs or suicide.
Okay, so with regard to access to health, there is a deficiency in access to mental health.
Yes, so especially for vulnerable groups.
Exactly. So your task as a person interested in health would be to look at the mental health bill that is proposed, see if when implemented it would cover your concerned population, your concerned teen mothers. Okay, and you're saying yes, this bill is implemented, would it actually take care of the teen mothers? Then you say, there's a gap here, because they're leaving most of the things to the county, and the teen mothers are being looked after by faith sector and whatever. So no. You need to improve the mental health bill. So you then make a recommendation asking government to, if it is already a law, to amend the law. If it is not a law, to adopt a policy, or to adopt a bill that will do what? That will give preference to teen mothers with regard to. Okay?
Yeah.
So generally, that's how the process works. So you make such a recommendation. Now, you have made your recommendation, for example, government to pass, okay, and implement the mental health bill. Okay?
Yes.
That is your recommendation you've made. How do you make sure that that recommendation is made to Kenya in the flow of the UN House? Because if it is not pronounced by any given state, it will form part of the recommendation Kenya has to implement in the coming 5 years. How would you do that? How would you make sure that your recommendation is made to Kenya by another state part of the United Nations? You understand my question?
Okay, I understand your question. Wait. I'd report the issue and the whole mental health bill to the UN representatives of Kenya.
UN representatives of Kenya already have their state report. For them, they have already said we have a mental health bill coming up. They are not saying they have adopted it. They are not saying they will adopt it. They only say we are processing the mental health bill. Now, for you, you want a recommendation, which if they accept it, they will do. So, choose any country that you would like to speak that on your behalf and tell us why you would choose that country and why you think it will accept to speak on your behalf.
Okay, must it be an African country?
No.
Okay, I'd pick maybe wait, maybe the United States or the UK.
Why? Why?
Because mental health there is something that is taken seriously in those countries, and people don't shy from therapy or providing counselors, because you see in their schools even there are counseling officers that actually work, compared to Kenyan high schools whereby the guidance counselor is someone who is going to judge you and probably won't help you as much as you'd like to be helped. And mental health there is actually on most insurance policies.
Okay, so because
compared to Kenya,
because US
it's something they strongly advocate for, so I think I'd like pick them to represent me because they take it seriously, so they probably advocate for these rights as the way Western countries are advocating for CSE education, because it's in Africa and Kenya especially. It's something they think that will work. They advocate for abortion services and Planned Parenthood services because it's something that's working for them and something they believe is right. Same to mental health. I'd like to think that advocate for it in Kenya because it's something they take seriously.
Okay, so you would target the USA. I'm narrowing it down. What would be the interest of USA in talking about mental health for Kenya? If you had something like...
I can't hear you. Your connection is buffering.
No, I think someone... Has it improved?
Hello? No, there's some static.
That must be... Hillary has something in this background.
Okay, Hillary, speak.
Hello?
Okay, I have muted almost everyone. Yes, Mumina. I'm trying to unmute you. Can you unmute? Yes.
Yeah, I've unmuted.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm asking. You have chosen USA because of what they do in their country. Okay?
Yes, and how they advocate for their people's rights in mental health.
Okay, but now I'm asking you, the relationship that Kenya has with USA is usually at the geopolitical level, geostrategic level, okay? They might be more interested in civil and political rights, non-discrimination, all that kind of things, okay? So you need to be examining what would be the interest of the US in speaking about mental health and not probably rights to assemble or not probably rights to freedom of speech, okay? You get the point. Yeah. Americans are largely interested, are usually, not always, but they're usually interested in civil and political rights. Okay, so that sometimes we even have to look and say, is America funding any health project? Does it have a health component? Usually you would target a government that has an interest in that area in terms of its foreign policy or its engagement with your country. If you just approach a country just because of what they're doing well back at home, it may sometimes not work. But yes, because US has been used as a benchmarking entity, if you can be able to demonstrate to the US that, look here, if government adopted this, then the American approach to psychotherapy will be adopted, then this will be adopted, then they will make such a recommendation. Meaning you would create an interest for them in that specific area. So those of us who've been involved in this process would target countries based on who is funding what in the country. Who is putting money behind planning for housing? Who is putting money behind this? Then those are the governments you would target, because rarely do they give aid as an end in itself. They usually give aid as a means to claim some influence over a sector. In that way, they would then quickly make the recommendations that fit into your criteria. Now, as you've mentioned, the sexual and reproductive health and rights are beginning to increasingly become part of the recommendations, partly because Europe has adopted it as its approach to foreign policy in many of our African countries. These sexual and reproductive health and rights are presumed to be the kind of rights that will be necessary to cut down human population, especially for any entities that think that human population is a liability, not an asset to the processes of development. So yes, the sexual and reproductive health and rights will be pushed, and they will be easy to be picked up by any EU government, because EU is struggling with migration issues, and in their thinking, if populations in the source countries drop, then there will not be a need for people to migrate en masse to come and take over their continent. So any SRHR recommendation is likely to be easily adopted by economy. Aza mumina watu tunasoma nao utafanyaje? Okay. So let's proceed. So yes, so we are at level 2. So we are in the plenary. You need to do what is called pre-session advocacy. Okay, for you to be able to get your recommendation in this report on any of your rights. Mumina has told us mental health because she's dealing with a health question, and she's interested in mental health for teen mothers. So she knows that we have a bill that is coming up, and that bill has been influenced by her organization to include the preference for teen mothers. And now we would like that recommendation to be made to the government so that the government declares to the whole world that in the next 5 years, I'll make sure that mental health issues for teen mothers are properly handled. So you then go and look around which governments are interested in matters of teenage pregnancy, which whatevers are interested in matters of protecting the mental health. Then you suggest it to them. And then when in public session, they will make that recommendation to the government. Now, when the recommendations are made, the government accepts those that it will work on, and it notes or rejects. So the word noted in a recommendation setup means rejected, meaning those recommendations that have not received the support of the state under review are also listed. The beauty about the UPR is that when a government chooses not to accept, when it notes, when it chooses not to give support to a recommendation received, it has to give reasons subsequently. I had the opportunity of participating in all the 3 cycles of the UPR. And the first cycle in 2010, the late Honorable Mutula Kilonzo was the Minister of Justice. And he led a powerful delegation. That guy was really very articulate. And so some of the nations there asked him 2 questions that stand out for me. One was on indigenous peoples. You see, what is the government doing about protecting the rights of indigenous persons? So he then says that, look here, in Kenya, everyone is indigenous. I think he knew what he was saying, but he was attempting to undermine the process. So he says in Kenya, everyone is indigenous. So these ideas of indigenous persons do not necessarily apply to the situation in Kenya. And for sure, Kenya was reviewed a few months before the promulgation of the constitution, because I think we voted in August and the guys had been in session in around April or May there. So he said, but in our constitution, we are taking care of minorities. So for sure, even though we have globally indigenous people's rights, these rights are clustered as a small component of minority rights in our constitution. It explains partly because why the Endoroyos case and people of Lamu have had to go to the African Court on human and people's rights to claim and challenge the development programs that are coming and unseating them and their indigenous lifestyles. The other question that popped up in 2010 related to, yes, the LGBTQ community. And when Honorable Mtula Kilonzo is asked this question, he says, look here, our people will have to be trained and educated to be able to understand these things, and it won't come easy, in the sense that he was saying that it's not generally accepted amongst our people. Now, this same position has popped up in the words of our president several times. He says this is not an issue, our people don't accept it. But these ideas have kept coming up as recommendations to Kenya in the various reviews. The most recent review of 2020 had so many recommendations relating to SRHR rights. Okay, so yes. Now, most of the challenges with housing in urban areas, says Hillary. I will like government to control migration. You'd like government to lock out people from entering the country. Maybe that's why Kenya has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. So you'd like to enforce Kenya's disobedience and a choice not to ratify this convention. You'd like government to reduce the cost. Or Hillary, maybe you meant rural to urban migration. Because when you say migration, it generally understood people coming from other countries into Kenya. Okay, reduce the cost of housing. Also, the government take better land to start something like factories, health centers, forcing the inhabitants to move to poor areas. Okay, so I think you must have meant rural urban migration. So government must stop dumping is done in water bodies. Okay, all right, so you have quite a number of recommendations, but the precision becomes necessary. So you've adjudged that the question of housing is undermined by these problems, and you think that if government accepts these recommendations and acts on them, then there was progressive improvement in access to the right to adequate housing. Caroline, for me, I think they don't see increase in population as a liability, but as a threat. Look at China, it is among the countries with higher population. That's why they have availability of labor and therefore thriving. Okay, yeah, it's part of the issue for sure that yes, the SRHR agenda will be pushed. It will be made the only way you can get money in the development world. It will be made priority in many government policies where Europe, the EU has influence, partly because the EU needs to keep the population down. That is partly part of it. The US is now an outlier. The Democrats used to push the SRHR agenda. They are now distressed that Obama is not, that Trump is not pushing the agenda. It might be part of the reason they are going to work tooth and nail to kick him out of office. If he keeps around for another term, the SRHR agenda might not get a lot of money from the US. But if leadership in the US changes in November, the SRHR agenda is going to be refunded by the US aid. And yes, the SRHR rights will become the rights that anyone has to talk about, and not food, not health, not education, not what. You only talk about food if it is pushing that agenda. You only talk about education if it is pushing that agenda. You only talk about housing if it is pushing that agenda. Okay. Now, Henry says that very true, but the difference between China and other countries comes in the proper utilization of resources. Well, okay. So yes, so the main review now, this review, I need to talk about it. When Kenya was being reviewed, it had a 3-hour session usually. Kenya had 70 minutes divided between giving a summary of its state report and responding to questions. Then the other minutes are left to the other states to make recommendations and to ask questions. The more the states, the fewer the time available. So the states, Kenya is off, so the remaining 193 countries If they are all present, there is a possibility that each state party will only have 30 seconds to speak. So the time available is divided among the states that would like to make a recommendation or ask questions. Then a report is generated and that report is adopted. When that report is adopted, that report then forms the document of the United Nations that will be used as the review for the next cycle. So we then do a follow-up. Follow-up means those of you who made recommendations and your recommendations were made to the state during stage 2, and when the government accepts those recommendations, it says it will do, you then come and follow up to see that government is doing. Even those recommendations that it rejected, you come and find out whether it has done anything about it. We have recommendations we made in 2015 that were rejected. One is that we invited government to spend 10% of GDP on agriculture as a way of improving the food production and deal with the right to food. And we also asked government to spend 15% of GDP on health so that we may deal with the challenges in the health sector. At that time in 2015, if you are aware, Honorable Githu Muigai was the Attorney General. At that same time, we had these issues of ICC still pending. So the state was a little bit tense. He turned the whole UPR process into a defense, and it was very reactive. And so anyway, at that time, many of our recommendations were rejected on the grounds that they were absolute in character. And they said that they were not taking into consideration the economic progress of the country. For sure, if government had accepted to spend 10% of GDP on agriculture, we would just be able to check in that financial year that followed to find out if 10% of the money has gone to agriculture. But for sure, government is still spending under 5% on agriculture, okay? And is still spending under 7% on health, even though the required and recommended target is 10 and 15%. Respectively. So when we came back from that review, and then doctors began striking, nurses were striking, I was not sympathetic at all to the state, okay, because the state had chosen not to accept a recommendation that seems to answer to these problems. If we got our doctors and nurses taken care of in their social security and their health, they will not run private clinics. They only run private clinics because they're not receiving locally competitive salaries. We need to be able to make sure they keep at the workplace and they're doing their job and they don't have to hunger for this extra buck and running private clinics, leaving our government facilities unattended. Anyway, so the follow-up process, we contacted the Kenya doctors and whatever health workers unions and whatever, pointed out our ideas. They took up the case and now they're using that argument in their advocacy, pushing for salary increments and whatever, okay? Because many a time government spends on priorities other than those that really touch the people. Health is a real issue, but whoever touches health wants to steal from it. So after the follow-up process, which takes place between 1 year of review and another year of review, in the sense of 5 years in between, you then go back to preparation of reports and you start another cycle of the UPR. So that's the report we prepared in 2014 for purposes of submitting, and these are the partnering organizations: Edmund Rice, Franciscans International, Pax Romana, and several others. We developed a lobby paper, and the main issues we talked about were food, water and sanitation, education, okay? And as you can see, we asked government to comply with its commitment under the Maputo Declaration by allocating at least 10% of its budget to agriculture development. That one they rejected. Prosecute corrupt officials. I don't remember what answer they gave for that one. Encourage crop diversification with an emphasis on orphan crops. This one was never met by any of the countries on our behalf, so we missed out on that. Then on the right to water, we raised concerns on the right to water and then made recommendation ask them to adopt the draft national water policy and enact a water bill to ensure their effective implementation. This has happened. Improve its regulation of water and sanitation service providers to ensure affordable, accessible, and available water and sanitation to all citizens. They're struggling with this one, but you can see what is happening within the Nairobi metropolitan. Some efforts are going on there. So yes, there are some things which you see that you make recommendations, the government accepts them, and government does something about it. I'm willing to take some questions now. If there are any. Yes.
You've said, does the review happen every 4 years or every 5 years?
Between 4.5 and 5 years.
Oh.
Yeah. Kenya's review seems to have stabilized at every January in the 5th year.
Yeah.
But some other countries could come a little earlier, so at 4.5 years.
Okay, thanks.
And these are processes you can participate in. I've gone to some civil society gatherings for review and I find my students there. And because they've been assigned to some NGO and that NGO has asked them to come and represent it in the review processes. So yes, it is a mechanism you need to be familiar with. Okay. If there are no other questions, can we plan to meet next week?
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Before we finish, there's a problem. Okay, in the Odell.
Yes.
We are trying to open the PDFs and they are not opening for the notes.
It would be good that you name the specific PDF because I'm told the upgrade affected some of those documents. So you have to
majority for the first class. Maybe I text you the PDFs after the class.
That document this and document this. When we click on it, it does not open, then I will reload it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other query? Fine. So thank you for your attention. We've been working for the last 2 hours and think it's fair enough that we retire. Someone is in the chat room. Does the judicial system of a country have input on the recommendations made in the country's report? Yes, it does. The judiciary would make its claim. The Lawyer Society, if it wants to submit, it will talk. The Commission of Jurists, the CSOs concerned about access to justice will also speak in the stakeholder report. And the State Department for Justice would gather information relating to access to justice. And if there are any hitches, yes, it can say what it is doing well and the challenges it is facing. And then recommendations can also be made in that area. I mean, because of the challenge between the judiciary now and the executive, there is a possibility that they will find a diplomatic way of saying the challenges without necessarily exposing the strife that is taking place there. But yes, that input will be included if it is impacting on access to justice. Like now, because of the appointment of the judges and whatever, they will always find a diplomatic way of explaining why that is taking place. Okay. I'll hang in there for another 2-3 minutes if there are any other questions before we close. Okay, now I'll invite each of you to get into the chat room and give an assessment of our learning since we started. Do you think this course has been worthwhile? since we started and why. If it's not been worthwhile, please state that Apana time and say why. Okay? We need to see, we are in the 5th class. This is midway because I don't think we are going to do more than that. You need to give reasons. Henry, it's not enough to say yes. Tasha, it's not enough to say yes. You need to give reasons. Why do you think?
Hello?
You need to give reasons. What value has the course so far in the last 5 weeks? What value has the course added to your learning within the context of your course on social work, within the context of your course on development studies? Okay, you need
Hello?
to say yes, it has been useful, and you give reasons. Momina, do what you're saying in the chat room.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we are using these last minutes. The next 3 minutes, one post in the chat room what your assessment of the course is so far. For the last 5 sessions we've had, what value is it adding? If it is not adding any value, please say it and say why you think it is just it's not meeting your expectations. You are a social work student. Why do you think you should do this course? What have you learned so far? How beneficial has it been? Development studies student, what value is it adding? Just type in the chat room, please, and let's move on. We have 2 minutes to go. Okay. So Henry, let me see. Okay. Tasha, it's been a progressive course coverage. I say this because stated the objectives of the course, gotten to understand how to analyze certain human rights and future can make substantial argument. Okay. For me, worthwhile because I have a deep understanding of human rights than I was before, and know as a social worker in future. Okay, in community, it's never in future, my friend. A social worker, once you're a social worker, you're already a social worker, even if you've just been in class for 2 years. Yeah, for me, it has been insignificant. Since in spite of having the PDFs, you are going a mile further explain to us. I think it's okay. Understand better on how to get to know more human rights. Okay. Okay, now I'm more interested in being sure that you guys are making sense of what we are doing. Students that go through my class always are supposed to be able to self-drive. Even before they graduate, they're able to participate in these things. If you choose a human rights activated NGO for your internship, you will find these processes useful, and you will be a useful addition to your to your community-based organization or NGO or entity that will engage you. Okay, so let's end here for now. I hope you guys will have gone to the field by the time we do our class next week, so that we can hear from you on the presentations. Hilary was supposed to present today, but he couldn't be with us early. I think we need to start listening to what people have found. I would expect that the PowerPoint you prepare tells us the right you've done. It tells us the sources. It tells us the normative criterion of that right, and then how you have used that normative criterion to describe the human rights situation on the ground. Okay, so yeah, next week I'll be randomly calling up people to help us do a sort of explanation on what they have covered so far. But priority for next class will be the conflict of rights before we delve into the human rights presentations. So I would say let's end here for now. Let's meet again next week.
Friday.